Hello everyone, today we talk again about education in the Middle Ages and specifically focusing on these two higher educational models that we have often seen for different reasons that we'll try to summarize today, just maybe an introduction for the rest of the videos, that are specifically the Bolognese Studium and the Masters of Paris. So first of all, there is to point out that the primacy of ecclesiastical teaching in the Middle Ages is a real thing. It was for most of medieval history, medieval Europe, and not only, by the way, in the sense that, also, of course, Christianity existed beyond Europe, but also other theistic systems had objectively, followed similar patterns in different ways. But the point, especially of low medieval civilization, of you could say high medieval civilization actually, and it was reinforced in, if you want, also sclerotized during the late Middle Ages to create what we know essentially as the Ancien Régime educational system, and that remained largely unaltered in many European countries for centuries to come, was properly a lay one, right? In fact, not all the cathedral schools from which that were essentially the main scholastic centers during the early and part of the High Middle Ages had an evolution in a universitary sense, right? We have talked enough, but not quite at the fullest, on the uniqueness of the universitary model as such. And most importantly, as we were saying now, not all the organisms of higher education derived from an ecclesiastical cultural center, right? I don't say this because, this is pretty well known to anybody who has studied medieval history, but every once in a while I make myself some scrabble to say, but why? I hear here and there, this idea, the church dominated everything. It was just about this system oppression. It was just for the elite. They didn't teach anything. This is actually not correct. This is not correct even for the times in which the church actually monopolized education, because early medieval education, for example, was much more accessible and open than it's believed. It's actually the secular one that during the late Middle Ages, okay, today together with the ecclesiastical one, sclerotized, but for reasons that specifically have not to do with in fact, the ecclesiasticness of it, right? And always consider, and I'm realizing the more I make these videos, that many of the prejudices that I have to struggle with in trying to portray this phase in history do not properly derive from an kind of a dark idea of the Middle Ages per se, right? You could say from the Enlightenment as it speak, but have a lot to do sometimes with the reformistic, and in part naturally also from the other side, the counter-reformistic side of the aisle. I mean, it's obvious that most of the most important countries in the world today derive, were fundamentally the land of the reform, right? In many ways, in different ways, because the German world is a very different world, for example, from the Anglo-Saxon one, or even just from the Scandinavian one, right? So, but to make the point here that there is a dark stigma that we have on medieval education and medieval church and so on that does derive from reformistic ideologies that naturally have their own meaning, but they should be contextualized in that specific sense. But at a mass level, popular culture, I do presume that there is the darkness of the Middle Ages also does derive from the alleged lack of a of a freedom, not just on ecclesiastical matters, on the autonomy from Rome and so on, but specifically from from the idea that also back in the day, certain areas of Europe, for example, were objectively not developed as much as they are today. So the idea is that was the dark point. And looking at, I don't know, other areas like Central or Southern Europe is a bit another paradigm, right? This is valid even just if we talk about France, right? Or Italy. That incidentally are the two countries we discussed today. Not just because they were the most advanced at the time, but especially because the development of medieval civilization largely passed. Also, as far as the surrounding countries were concerned, very important. Even Spain had its own thing. England was objectively an appendix in many ways of French culture, especially at these higher institutional levels. And so it's difficult to talk about this without either say fearing that the average interlocutor would not get what the point is here, or spreading the sense of malaise by saying, you need to point out that this were the most advanced, the least advanced. Well, the point is that if we don't have that clear, I can even talk about this in general terms, but it will not make any specific good in some ways. Because how can I explain to you what the Masters of Paris were, or the Bolognese Studium was, if I don't explain what France was at the time, what Italy was at the time, and why they began with these forms of education? Nor if you think that this was just kind of corrupt conspiracy that wanted to rule Europe from the height of this terrible orthodoxy that, thank God or whoever for him that there has been an orthodoxy and a hierarchy in the world, and we don't live in a constant state of of instability and extremism and lack of central power. The point is that naturally a great deal of improvement passed through these channels, and yet in very different ways. And this is also the didactic side of it, because if we look at France and Italy, we do see about two countries at the time had this extraordinary development, but we also see two very different models on their own. In a way, even antithetic, especially as far as the institutional forms were concerned, formally. Because from one side we have the most developed kingdom in Europe. From the other side we have essentially the most developed city-states. And even in here we can discuss, because for example France had, today we talk about essentially the 11th, 13th century. A lot of things changed over these centuries. The France of the end of the 11th century, when Pepin and Irenarius found the Bolognese Studium, is a much more contained and restricted France. It would be better to call it gold still at some point. By the 13th century, the French now are the almost hegemonic country in Europe, which is a big word for medieval standards. It's probably not even correct, but I mean it's definitely the most advanced, most powerful kingdom out there. As far as Italy is concerned, we also find something very different. Italy was a kingdom too, formally speaking, but it's literally the thing that looks the least like a kingdom from any standard, because it's essentially this cluster of essentially 30 city-states in the center and the north that make specifically the Italic kingdom, that rule themselves, right, and by themselves, and also start doing very weird things for medieval institutional and political standards, such as invading other cities and territories and starting ruling over these realities. And even more strange, but that we will not discuss today in some terms, is naturally the Kingdom of Germany, and or better put the Central European land of the Holy Roman Empire, because the intervention, for example, in the Italian peninsula was as you know, in the long run unsuccessful, but also boosted part of this civil development as a reaction to the interference, or sometimes even with specific rights that were granted to this specifically to the University of Bologna to produce theory, juridical theory, and practice, and so on. It would be enormous. So we could say, as you know, the University of Paris becomes the theological capital of Europe, right? And the reason being that it was located in what was becoming de facto the capital of the most powerful kingdom out there, that had also, despite for the same reasons for which it was becoming one, a very specific political and social structure where the elites had an overwhelming power, unlike any other land in Europe, which means there were few people, the high nobility, the higher clergy, that had enormous amounts of wealth, and there were lots of other communities, sometimes also autonomous. I mean, the French had their own communes, as any other land in Europe, but still framed under this very hierarchical system. It was growing ever more so. So this all went in parallel, naturally, the support of the to the kingdom by the clergy. There were some frictions, as always in all of these countries, for the same reason, but we can say, generally speaking, the secular and ecclesiastical power went along fairly well and backed each other as elites. Therefore, France produces, naturally, and needs not just what will emerge as, especially in the 13th century, after their victory over the Anglo-Germans, this enormous also administrative apparatus that is something completely anew, will create problems to France in a way, but on the long run will also allow the kingdom to surpass the crisis of the 14th century. You know, before the 12th, the 13th, there wasn't much of that, right? So there is a lot of experimentation. It wasn't nothing even strictly teleological about the construction of the French monarchy at some point. But it immediately develops this very concrete ideological sense of itself, right? The French monarchy is also, as you know, a dynastic one. And France, for example, has a lower public culture, for example, than, I don't know, even England, for example, or Sicily. So these kingdoms had been born in different ways, right? France emerged from the mess that post-Carolingian Europe had turned into in terms of local jurisdictions and so on, so that we can speak properly of a feudal monarchy that doesn't emerge as a public state. It emerges like just a dynasty that is more powerful than others, surely within the Carolingian districtuation, I mean the Western Frankish kingdom and so on. But it's different from what the Normans did in England and in Sicily, where they first of all entered in realities that didn't know feudalism as such, and that are able actually to import it, but to politically, institutionally balance it in ways that in Central Europe were unknown. And this is a tremendous ideology because it's naturally very personal, right? It's based on the allegiance to the king, right? And this is no surprise that by the end of the Middle Ages, France will be fundamentally also the most advanced state, in a way, in terms of practical power, right? And not much, however, in terms of strict centralization. Now, we can't explain the reasons of the ways this happened. This is not our own one. But it's obviously, it's important to explain it, to understand how and why Paris would become the theological capital of this world. Because by controlling the orthodoxy of the Gallic, let's call it this way, communities, there could be also a royal ideology could be enforced more effectively, right? And becoming all one, creating literally a mystics of monarchy. As we were saying before, Italy has nothing to do with that. The Italic kingdom as something that could be guided by a private dynasty is something that ends fundamentally at the beginning of the 11th century, right? From now on, Italy is this, let's say, I can even call it an appendix, because technically it was the most important kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire, because without the Italic crown there could be no imperial crowning in Rome as well by the papacy. It was yet another thing, but also here there would be the need to digress on what the emperors and the popes believed respectively Rome concretely was, and what the Romans also believed, because Rome technically was a commune like all the others. So, and the Roman Church is here something goes beyond earthly power, but supersedes it, of course, as far especially as the papacy was concerned. So these city-states took over, and they took over simply because the Germanic monarchs at certain point didn't intervene, or at least anymore in the kingdom, or at least didn't intervene energically enough to try to organize the territory in a more controllable way. As you know, in the second half of the 12th century, the Hohenstaufen starts also this series of campaigns in Italy that will last for 1 century, because between there were periods of peace, but up to the death of Frederick II in 1250, the Swabians kept fighting in the peninsula, and albeit this happened after the end of the struggle for the investitures, that is conventionally 1122, which in my opinion didn't end a good nothing, because it was just a compromise that the papacy could appoint the bishops in Italy and the emperor in Germany, and it didn't end a good nothing, simply because the papacy and the empire kept quarreling, albeit being allies, unavoidably allied in the theory of what was the universal policy. They would continue fighting in these clashes, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, that is the pro-imperial, respectively the pro-papal and pro-imperial side, with a branching actually that takes place also in Germany, because also technically the terminology of Guelph Ghibelline is born technically it's born in Italy, but it was referring to the German political parties, because naturally also in Germany there was no unitary monarchy, right? It was not like France or in England. So differently from Italy, though, Germany is not as urbanized, and cities specifically do not yet. They gain important freedoms and or better autonomies, but they in the factual practice, but they never make it to emancipate themselves from princely rule. Maybe exception for Switzerland in the 14th century, which was, however, a peripheral area. The question, therefore, remains for most of medieval history and of this axis between Germany and Italy, that is, I presume, deeply overlooked in European history at so many levels, because today, once again, we decide that Germany and Italy are a bit like the antinomy, right? That they are two dramatically different countries, that they embody two different ways of lives. Most of this history, and as far as this reveals how much Europeans actually don't care about the Holy Roman Empire in its true essence, remained, and especially in these centuries, and here as far as the political theory, juridical practice development of the whole continent was involved, at the center of literally of European history as such. Why? Because the imperial and papal clash was based fundamentally on juridical prerogatives, right? Law was consistently the single most important measure of effective power from the side of a ruler, because the only legitimization of a sovereign rule derived from the communities, right? Up to the 19th century, with the Code Napoleon, that basically states that the state is the only source of law. Every land at the time was ruled by common law, right? So much that even the Roman law, that is intended as something different here, or in theory, becomes de facto common law, right? The revival of Roman law wasn't what would have been wished in theory also by the Holy Roman Emperors, and in part also by the papacy, because at the end of the day they were trying to do the same things specularly. What, I don't know, it was, for example, the Byzantine Empire, where for example the emperor had always ruled from a kind of a statal, at least standpoint, at least namely speaking. Then also the Byzantine Empire went towards a privatization of power on the long run, but the fundamentals were very, very, very different. And therefore it was quite important to revive Roman law, for a Holy Roman Emperor was trying to impose its own rule, to impose the primacy of earthly rule on earth, right? Not in heaven, of the emperor over the papacy, or better, that could essentially manage the secular matter of the clergy, which is literally so, because there is a secular clergy, and this is exactly over which the battle, the struggle for investitures was fought over, that is the appointment of the bishops. As you know, none of the two sides will fundamentally win, and we also made a video about the rise of national monarchies and how this, towards the 14th century, I would say paved the road. Even here there's nothing theological about it, but it took half of a millennium to the rise of the nation state in some degree. And this enormous battle between the papacy and the empire, given the lack of specific power, because the emperor was very powerful. The 12th century especially sees the Swabians as the most powerful Western rulers, but it's still not enough for them nor to rule over Italy and the papacy, nor over Germany itself, right? Because it was nothing like that ever. The peak was reached under Frederick I, and even in there was basically not much could be done. From Frederick II already, they gave up, right? The German emperors preferred to essentially behave exclusively like the other private rulers did in Germany, and to essentially get money and other powers in exchange for legitimization given by now this formal, up to a certain point, formal power. I don't like to stress the fact that the dramaticity of the fact that after the Hohenstaufen now all the imperial power was depleted. It's not really true. But objectively, it began to take very different forms institutionally, and also in the political practice. We're talking about something very different from what it had happened before. But times had gone on, and they had gone on exactly also through these juridical developments. So why is Bologna so important, right? So this is the key of it. It's not just because it was the first European university, nor because it remained objectively the center of this school that became by the default, right? the juridical one in Europe up to the the 16th century, essentially, and produced an astonishing amount of works that were extremely sophisticated in terms of juridical science. The main problem is fundamentally political, right? And also it strikes how early this thing began. Because here, in the passage between the 11th to the 12th century, certain masters, first Pep and then Irnerius, we made this, we clarified what these people were in the video. There is a playlist called Medieval Law, right? And we addressed these issues quite frequently, so if you're interested, you can find more information there. I will not repeat myself. If not, for one fundamental important, it really explains to you how the myth of the medieval society dominated by the authority, without which nobody could say anything. Well, these people had started the teaching of Roman law by their own initiative and without any authorization. Right? These people simply began to make money giving legal assistance to this very dynamic Italic society that had the France, we said it also many times, France was the richest country in Europe in absolute terms. Italy was the richest country in Europe and actually in the world in relative terms. That means per capita wealth. There was an extremely dynamic market of landed property. Was a had a highly monetary economy for the highest in Europe for at the time. There were lots of transactions. Most of the wealth shifted between Europe and the East passed exactly through these cities. So the Italians start needing new instruments to regulate business, transactions, contracts, and especially to certify the latter through an authority that is the one of the notaries that actually in Italy existed very early. Before this, or in Ottonian times, the Ottonians were struck by the levels of literacy in the Italian cities, and they were extremely interested in it already at that time, because they understood that those forms of government and of administration might have been very useful to a German monarchy that was trying to centralize, specifically in Germany, where there wasn't much of a substratum, of a base to afford that. And the thing went on, because as we were saying before, the German and Italian, let's say, paths were deeply intertwined. The Holy Roman Emperors were Holy Roman Emperors, right? It's not about being German, but about being Italian. They were the rightful public authority, and even the greatest all over Christendom. So much that in theory, aside from what political practice eventually came to sanction, the Holy Roman Empire was extended to all of Christianity, at least of Western Christianity. Theoretically, also France, Spain, they were under the Holy Roman Empire, or better, they were liable of response to the supreme authority. The fact that these masters begin to teach completely by themselves with private means, right? These were masters that literally people went to them and they said in groups and said, look, we want to learn law, and especially this new thing of Roman law that you're reviving now in your studies, and what did they say, and so on, because it was becoming something very, very complex, and we'll pay you, right? And these people rented rooms, attendance. I mean, the university was born specifically like this. There wasn't a university that before this one, the Bolognese model, was created out of. There were just the cathedral schools, so from which also most of these masters came from, as laymen, by the way, right? That is another thing. These were not clergymen. Surprise, surprise. The Italian cities before the communes were namely, look at Ottonian times, ruled by bishops, because the dioceses were the most structured administrative system since Roman times in these worlds, and the bishop ruled the city, as a matter of fact, but it needed lay personnel, right? It needed lay personnel, as monasteries did, as others. So also the idea of the dominance of the clergy is actually very, very Northern European in mindset, and that's why before I said also that it randomly it came to overlap also eventually with the reformistic contempt towards what was happening in these lands that were evidently most Catholic, and that, however, had developed since a very early time also properly a lay government and what would become essentially the cradle of modern state building. And the interesting thing, naturally, is how much the authorities, both the empire and the papacy, are interested in these studies. Because these people know law like hell, right? And especially they know Roman law, right? These guys are making an enormous work of civilization, of recomposing all the Roman law, studying it, applying it, making it work, not substituting it to the previous law, but by integrating with it, because the initial motivation was exactly this one, right? Roman law, even in here, as it was portrayed in reformistic times as the imposition of eventually the Catholic lands as a system of hierarchy and of uncontested authority, which was true at the time, indeed, at the time of Reformation, emerged from this clericization of the Ancien Regime in these lands that had, as we've seen, such powerful elites at a point they contracted because they were too powerful, they couldn't be countered. But we're talking about the 15th century, the 16th century, and this time there is a dramatic fluidity, a dramatic openness, and that are all accompanied by this the highest levels of individual education in Europe, which was lay one, right? It was lay, and it did exist in parallel still to the ecclesiastical one. So the studying of the Justinian corpus was connected, of course, also with canon law, because the church herself was developing in parallel its own juridical system. Now, first of all, realize how these developments go fundamentally in parallel, right? It's not that this thing emerged magically at this point and also randomly the Masters of Paris emerged. I mean, this was part of a broader revival of European society, socio-economical activity, and so on. So every system began to afford enough resources to dedicate also the theoretical side of the story. And the fascinating aspect of it is that, aside from the universal aim of all, right, or better, the Bolognese Studium didn't really care to create a universal system per se, right? They of course lived within the idea that whatever they were reconstructing was to be used in a universalistic sense, but these people were very practically oriented. I mean, they did this to make money. They weren't, as we have seen, monarchs that needed to impose it. These were common lawyers, notaries, right? They lived as citizens in the communes, in the city-states. They had their own political interest, but their political interest stopped at their own city district, and then as far as the neighbors were concerned, those were just a bunch of bastards. You had to raid the district of every once in a while. Of course, there was, telling the truth, a lot of a lot of dialogue all over across all these cities. Students came from everywhere, as we'll see in a while. So there was actually and especially in Italy, in this ferocious competition between city-states, an enormous homogenization, not just of juridical practice, but also of political, institutional, even military practice. We will see it. We have already seen it, telling the truth, but we will keep seeing it better at this point. But it was mainly, it was not much ideological. It's just like the clash of the Lombard League in the same years against the Holy Roman Empire. It's not that they cared about whether, I mean, they were perfectly reasoning as subjects of the empire, even when they were taking arms against the emperor. As far as they were concerned, things had always been like that. They didn't care. They just wanted to do whatever they wanted in their own environment, fundamentally, not to be imposed taxes and so on, which is usually how and why people take arms and to defend their rights, as usual. And the papacy instead was doing something much more grandiose at many levels, because of course at this point its power was growing as enormously, but also challenged, especially during the 12th century. During the 13th there will be the apotheosis of papal power. Then in the later centuries also its contraction, but that had specifically a universal aim. That was also the one of had been expressed since the Dictatus Papa in 1075, the beginning of the struggle for investitures. The one of essentially surpassing the emperor in terms also of management of the church, but also in the same earthly matters, that is, up to the point of deciding who was fit or not to become emperor, for example. So that was you understand the magnitude of this, right? As a broader mover of this enormous medieval civilization. From their side, as we've seen, the emperors did the same things, right? And since in Germany they didn't have much the men and materiel to develop equally these juridical theories, Frederick I, that is the first that enters very openly into this picture, as we have seen, begins to draw dramatically men and ideas and so on from the Bolognese experts of law, right? That also served him as consulates of the emperor. Was a huge prestige. As we have seen before, both Germany and Italy were split between those who favored, it's even bad to say favored the papacy, because the Guelph bloc was never as, let's say, faithful to the ideals as the Ghibelline one really was. I mean, half of this system worked for the emperor, and they mostly truly believed in the thing, because it was believed from a medieval mind that was the natural order of things. The Guelphs were, supporting the papacy, because at that point the papacy was the enemy of the empire, but technically they were fighting just for being completely autonomous, not having anybody telling them what to do. But what I would like to stress in here is that the reconstruction of the Justinian corpus was an asset, right? It's not just but you would think all medieval history is based on swords and clashes and things like force. Most of this struggle was, of course, as always, as in all history, political, and it dramatically passed through this science, juridical science, and having that meant to have concrete power, right, and knowing how to use it. And this is pretty evident in Frederick's Italian policy, as the emperor was requiring at this point, first of all, a juridical definition of the political superiority of the empire over the autonomous centers of powers that had been created in central and northern Italy. But at the same time, he was struggling to do a lot of other things that included fundamentally the reconstruction of the Roman Empire with Europe and the Mediterranean, that however failed because of exactly this, the opposition of the same powers in a way, those among which wealth powers that were surely jurists of equal expertise to the ones of the Studium of Bologna, but that were now using the same weapons in favor of the papacy, or at least against the empire. And what I would like also to point out here is that Frederick, and we know this from many sources, I mean the Germans in general at the time, objectively couldn't understand. I mean, they alleged, they acknowledged the fact that the Italian reality existed in the way it had taken form, but from a feudal mindset as the one they had, that they had also acquired in a different way from the French. But this is by the time of Barbarossa, we can't say that it was now a feudal reality without too many differences. That, for example, a city-state could impose its rule, as it was done, over the feudal nobility, right? Never give for granted this when you study this history. Never give for granted the inconceivable disorder. I mean, this was seen as a monstrosity. How could a city like Milan, I don't know, demand to the nobles of countryside, who were vassals of the emperor, to be ruled, and that they were ruled. This was something incredible, but the problem is that that same juridical knowledge came from this lens. So there was this. Now maybe it's a lot of time we don't talk about this story here, but it's important to stress also here the intelligence of Frederick himself, as far as the realization that part of this culture was needed to make things work, because objectively this culture that couldn't make and conceive the idea of a nobleman ruled by a citizen was the one of public authority. That was exactly what the emperor was seeking for itself as an individual ruler, right? And that these cities by themselves had already gained by themselves first in Europe, because all over this thing was not even contemplated as a possibility. This is the fascinating aspect of the story, that we're looking at feudal realities that, as we've seen, were based on personal power, and that had built their own juridical, let's say their jurisdictions specifically, their juridical prerogatives, on custom, on practice, on the idea that, I don't know, the thing had always been like that. The Lord had, maybe no emperor, king had ever given him a right to do so, but, ever since anybody could remember, he had rights over that mill, over that peasant community, over that city, and so it was it, right? And it was naturally always negotiated, but it was negotiated sometimes from the position of asymmetrical relations, as you can imagine. Not always, because as the clash with the Lombard League, this negotiation entailed that this communes managed even to defeat the emperor. But the emperor granted in 1158, this is very important in the history of Europe, the privilege of the Bolognese Studium of a constitution known in Latin as Authentica Habita, through which the jurisdictional autonomy was granted to the Studium, in fact, together with the imperial protection for the foreign students. Right. European universities are born with the idea as that existed at the time and it is revealed by the same name of university that actually at the time was used to define any form of association, right? The empire was a university. The peasant leagues were a university. Everything was a university. Also, this guilds of students fundamentally were called university, and that's universitas. That's a word that we take ourselves back from this medieval lexicon, which is very beautiful because we rarely do, right? And especially for such an important institution, and that is the foundation of Western education, right? So reflect on it. That is born also naturally within the concept of university and of universalism, and therefore the fact that everybody could participate to it. Like other universities, the literally, I mean, the other medieval ones that existed, the universities we're talking about as educational centers were composed by guilds of students, also of different nations. The nationes literally meant that were called as such, not in the truly national sense, but that we use today, but in the Latin one of the term, that surely, however, at this time had already taken another form compared to the ancient one. So that was the nation of the Nazio, of the Anglici, the Transalpini, the Italici, the Germani, all these things in Latin that were specifically referring to where you came from. And naturally, many were mixed, there were many synecdoches. Everything was, however, regulated in the sense that every part had its own autonomy. And this was the base of which the medieval world was conceived. So why also the Constitutio Habita is so important? Because the Friderician Act constituted the first point of constant reference for any other scholastic privilege, right? So in theory, the emperor, what does this mean? It means that the emperor at the time was, first of all, legitimizing himself by saying, look, I'm the emperor, I confer this privilege, and naturally the university kept it very, very dearly with itself, but at the same time, what's the value now? Imperial power. It's not an absolute power. And in fact, in spite of the imperial document, in front of the pressures of the commune of Bologna, it was yet another thing. It was not the university, it was properly the commune. Especially the foreign students had to reinforce the ties between themselves to safeguard themselves in their own goods, because there were even here asymmetries that had to be taken into consideration, such as the fact that also other universities were being born, for example, but also the fact simply there were foreigners, that they had to come from across the Alps to Italy to study, to get this sap of law that they needed as for their. It was an extremely prestigious institution, as you understand. But what I meant is also that there weren't just universities being born because of imperial acts, like Bologna wasn't already, for example, because it was born by itself. But throughout all the Middle Ages, you see that there were universities developing on their own, and eventually sanctioned by this or that power. It could be usually imperial, papal, but it could even be royal. And other universities would simply legitimize themselves by themselves, right? What does this mean? Is that, the other powers didn't recognize them? No, they recognized them, but they didn't necessarily play with them in order to legitimize them and to get self-legitimization. Why this is important? Because, of course, Europe was growing, and all these various polities needed skilled personnel in legal matters to govern, to create an administration. They couldn't just use the clergy. They needed a lay, autonomous personnel, right? People now start getting paid with money, or ever more to receive salaries, to be sent here and there to gain expertise, to travel across all of Europe, as we have just seen. And the same universities become polities in many ways. They surely had a heavy political weight. They organized themselves into nationes, as we have seen, and universitas as such, reuniting in deliberative assemblies, giving themselves statutes and rules, controlling the imparted teachings, also surveilling the didactic activity of the teachers, right? Which sounds something strange, but it's really not, because at the time, as we've seen, the universities had been created mostly by the students, not by the masters, because the masters more or less always had a good job, right? But unless there wasn't this request, until there wasn't this request from the student, from these people that wanted to know law, of course, even the university was not standing, right? Because otherwise, the master, like Irenaeus said, we would have simply kept leaving teaching for the capitular school with their money. It would have been fine in part. Naturally, there were huge interests, but another important aspect of the medieval university is how important the lawyers were considered in the political and social spectrum of the cities, right? The teachers, properly the doctors of law, were considered equally as knights, for example. They were literally knighted. They passed through this very harsh selections, right? These people also, today we don't talk about the methods of teaching properly, but rather about the organization of these institutions, the models of, at least of, also the institutional model properly of the institution itself. But they learned an astonishing, these people knew by heart the entire Justinian corpus, right? People at the time had a way more advanced mnemonic capability than we do today. Today we don't learn anything by heart anymore. We are the use we make of our brain is utterly disgusting at this time. These people learned an enormous amount of things. There are people that knew the Bible by heart, and they spent literally an entire life to try not just to learn by heart, but also to build a new system that before had been never seen, or at least was trying to be reconstructed, but also adapted to the reality of the current current juridical practice that differed, was not even contemplated by the Roman one, because medieval society in many ways was already more complicated and more advanced too. So this required an enormous effort that was based on nothing. Today you go to universities and you essentially learn something that is fact checkable, that you have, or you can go find easily, you can research on, you have specific institutions of reference. At the time, these masters and these students basically began to create something new, completely on their own, right? And completely for practical need. All the glossarists, this astonishing work they achieved of putting together all the various comments, all the various commentaries, in fact, of the Justinian work, and to make of it a systematic work. This is what the greatest jurists of the Bolognese school achieved, and they were revered for this. It was a huge impact all over. It spread, stimulated an enormous political reflection. Where did rights stem from? What was the communities? What were the communities doing with this? They began to study better, also philologically, historically, the ancient sources. Humanism is born from this world, right? When you wonder why we study this chapter of European history, and objectively, how many times do are you exposed to this in popular culture? How many people even care? Right, the Middle Ages, it's just the castles, the fire, the mud. But if you don't picture clearly what were the political institutional essentials of the Holy Roman Empire or of France, and you don't put it at the radical center of the whole understanding of medieval history, the question is, what kind of Middle Ages are you even trying to talk about? Right, and this is what I try to do on Schwerpunkt as well, is that to raise awareness on the fact that this is no niche content. This is exactly what you're first of all forced to study if you study medieval history. I can say that everywhere in the world it's the same, and this is also disturbing at many levels, because there are certain countries that prefer the ethnicistic side of the story, that marginalize sometimes even these areas. Right, I am biased, and I'm open to it, but to me, I can say there is a land that is more important than another one. To me, the Middle Ages wouldn't exist if you don't study medieval Scandinavia, if you don't study medieval Spain, if you don't study the Byzantine Empire, if you don't study Ireland, Russia, Islam, but let's be honest. I mean, in terms of specific weight, and also in terms of a bit of the narrower picture that maybe we have of Westernness in relative, you don't have maybe just necessarily to look at the geography of it. You can't simply say, okay, well, it's France, Italy, and Germany that count. Well, it's not entirely that, but I mean, the Frankish world broadly meant, and its expansion that becomes to encompass Britain, obviously with the Norman conquest, but also Spain, but also by the many contacts of the Reconquista, Central Europe broadly meant, arriving up, of course, through Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, and beyond, because at a certain point even the Byzantine Empire is conquered by the Franks, and the world that has stemmed from this. Well, you have to look at this areas of Europe, this centrality, because otherwise, what are we studying it for? This is the question I pose myself. You see, I don't make these videos because I want to stress the fact that, I don't know, just to lament myself that people do not know history. Or better, I do that, but the obvious reason why I do it is that there is a great damage deriving from this ignorance. I mean, a great damage in our political, civical, ethical, social culture, right? What do you think Europe will become in 50 years if young people are not taught this? It did nothing, because it's like not even being European properly. What does it mean today being European? Basically, history has remained the only let's say, catalyzer of European identity, right? Because this identity passes fundamentally through knowledge. If you don't know these things, it means you can't even understand the moral problem that stood between an emperor and a pope that fought over, together with the rest of Christian Europe, for these problems. You don't understand the value of civic rights, of resistance, even of armed resistance, if you don't study specifically these clashes. It's useless to go around that, right? It's useless to think that one country here is the only thing that exists and around there is nothing, right? Europe was Europe at this time already, even if they didn't completely picture itself, but the essentials of what Europe and the West became lays within this clashes, right? And it's clashes because without confrontation, you don't have civic growth, right? If you remain isolated in a world where nothing happens, or there is a very low kinetic energy, civilization is not produced there. There's a few to do with it. I'm sorry. It's not about culture. I mean, culture, I agree wholeheartedly. Cultures cannot be properly compared because they are something like a contextual product. But if we speak of civilization is something very precise that also etymologically pertains to our Western language. It has to do with civic rights. And if you think that civic right now it's the same, I live in a tribe, it's the same thing. No, it's not the same thing. There's a deep moral divide between the two systems. And this is what I fear the West is losing. The completely the perception that these events did make a difference. It's not a weird story where you can make YouTube videos about how let's look at what were the most wicked popes of the Middle Ages. Wow, what an amazing video. And then you don't know ecclesiastical history. What kind of I mean objectively, I mean if you don't know Christian history, what do you know about the world? And I mean it broadly meant, because aside, okay, let's I could easily even say that if you don't know that, you don't know the entire world history, because at a point the West came to rule the world. But even if leaving that aside, the question is properly, and you know that these contents are mainly for Westerners, in the sense that everybody's welcome on Schwerpunkt, and I would very much like to acquaint lots of people to realities that I don't know, if you were born in India, you don't necessarily have to know what the Bolognese Studium was, but if maybe you are, you get to know it. Wow, that's great, right? And I'm not, believe me, not even in Europe people know what this thing is about. But it's not because of India have a particular, it could be China, it could be whatever. But the question here, these contents are for Westerners in the sense is, will you wake up realizing that if you have never even bothered yourself to read something about these things, you cannot properly understand most of even just your political discourse in 2020. This is something that I never hear. Like, I look at political commentaries. History is instrumentalized in a disgusting way, right? Like mostly pointing out a few things that you pretend that it's mostly hearsay, it's cliches, it's things that used to back here and there political discourse about what people do not understand. There's a lot of confusion, right? Even just if you look at liberals or conservatives, sometimes they're schizophrenic. Like there are certain aspects they like about everybody interprets. I don't know what your idea of the Enlightenment was. It positive or negative? What about Middle Ages? Was it positive or negative? There's a lot of confusion sometimes. There is the contrasting ideas, and the most obvious thing, if you're not a moral relativist, is that either that one of the two is at least worse as a conception than the other, right? And that's what I believe in. That extremism is also particularly stupid because it reveals that at least one of the two sides is wrong, because there are not two different truths, right? This is something that you can propose to somebody who was not acquainted to logical, rational thinking in worlds that historically and culturally were not acquainted to that. Here we are in the West, and we reason like that, and if you refuse that, it means that you're not a Westerner. That's my thermometer of Westernness. And I'm very, very careful about this. I do think it matters as it has never done before. I would like to say more and explain also why today it counts more, but to put it simply, it's because theory is now all what matters, right? Not that practice doesn't anymore, but we have found ways to control it at the point we need mostly a theoretical teaching now. If this theoretical teaching doesn't even start from this basis, we're done for. Right? We are done for. We're done for. I repeat it. Literally, there is a fil rouge that passes from not knowing what were the masters of Paris to the fact that in 50 years Europeans will be forced to learn Chinese because they will not have a place in the world anymore. Right? And believe me, it will happen, because I don't see anything in Europe now that looks anything like a true care about one another, a true understanding about one another. I see just a resurgence of tribalism, of ethno-nationalism, of division, of lack of civic education, of historical education, of moral values, I don't see anything going better, right? Maybe quality of life, but quality of life is not enough, right? You can't, make a person living like in a 5-star hotel. That will not make it an intelligent person, a righteous person, a capable person, right? And it's a serious problem. Right? Naturally, we have ways to enforce education, but my point is also that that specific education doesn't quite work anymore. We don't study what matters on school books. It's the times in which we needed simply to alphabetize the masses are over. Today we need to give them a civic backbone, something that up to the point the problem was just working, was not really needed. Today we need to think, which is another thing, right? Ever more than we have done in the past, right? There is an enormous imbalance compared to just 100 years ago between the people who were needed structurally, systematically in the tertiary field to know how to think than those that we need that have to know how to do, right? The things that the numbers have reversed. Now the majority of people are needed to think rather than to do, to make things work, right? So, speaking of the French, we have seen the Bolognese Studium is something very autonomous, even very fragmented, very communitarian in many ways. In Paris, as we've seen in France, broadly meant at this point in Capetian France, there's a much more elitary reality. In fact, in Paris, it's the masters that prevail, right? It's not the students that have this dramatic capacity of literally, even sometimes splitting the university, making a secession and going to another city that maybe it's rival they've heard. No. Here there is a much more hierarchic, unitary, composed, framed, and controlled reality, in which, however, the students are fundamentally obedient, right? I can't say, because naturally during the 12th century, especially the Studium of the School of Paris became a seat of very dangerous problems, right? Because if you concentrate everything on intellectual speculation, then something may happen. That is what happened, and also changed the history of Europe forever. That is the spread of heresies. We've talked a lot about heresies, or maybe not so much, but at least in the way we addressed them, I think we touched important points already, and we will keep doing it. But you know pretty well what happened in Paris. I mean, from a certain generation, the certain masters began to own very unorthodox ideas. The reason being that these were the vanguards, the forerunners of much more important and sophisticated thinking. Think about Abelard. We made a video on him, Abelard and Eloise. We made videos about the other specific figures that had also inspired the scholars back in the day that had been found to be heretical, that spread the heresies often even at generations of distance, right? While retracting where they were accused by their students, actually teaching that to generation after, and so this study was controlled. But the point is that you cannot really stop ideas. History teaches this. That is to say, even in this most crystallized reality that was still very fluid, though it was just for medieval standards, ideas move, right? And there is nothing like a politics in society that always remains the same, because ideas are always different and they cannot be stopped, right? No totalitarianism ever prevailed in the end, right? And most of totalitarianisms also prevailed because there were people who made it prevail, right? A very reformistic cultural idea is the one of tyranny. The idea that the problem is that evil guy, right? And not, which is could create problems, right? Because most of the time, most people are pretty evil in their own kind. It takes even just a little bit. We all are, and we all know it. But that is enough to make a lot of things go wrong. It's never about the tyrant. It's about who has the interest of the system remaining like that. The masters of Paris spread Aristotle, that was seen at the beginning by the ecclesiastical authorities that were fundamentally centered, culturally speaking, on Neoplatonism, right? Because that was fundamentally in Western Europe had prevailed from the Augustinian tradition in the schools and so on. Prevailed Aristotle, that naturally had many important things, but it was filtered by the Arab source and so on. But it was a highly scientific content that made very heavy statements naturally over the universe, the world, the role of man, and this fascinated dramatically the highest intellectuals of the time in these schools. Also consider that France, and this is true also for Italy up to a certain point, but in Italy you don't find this form of elitism. You find individuals that go and take back a lot of information, develop even genial things at a technical, even accounting point of view. I mean, they manage to fluidify society from the bottom. In Paris, you have these powerful ideas to start from the top, the cradle of the highest learning. It's like an epidemic. It cannot be stopped. So much by the 13th century, the scholastic reform, if you want to call it even just like that, will integrate Aristotle into the Christian physics fundamentally, and beyond in a way, which is also one of the single most important works of civilization ever accomplished by the French, by the papacy, by a lot of intellectuals coming from all Western Europe that achieved what in fact would remain at the center of the Catholic mindset, just as the Ptolemaics, the Aristotelic Ptolemaic system. Think about Galileo and the problem of heliocentricity and so on. I mean, we're talking about now how much? Basically half of a millennium of Western history dominated by this thought. And if you wonder, whether this was a positive thing or not, it's always a matter of perspective. If you reason from the times of Galileo or Newton, the scientific revolution, you will say that this is a load of, which is also very reductive if you actually study scholastics and what it is about. But if you look at it from this point of view, this was an incredibly innovative thing. It's as if now the most radical ideas prevailed, right? At least radical as far as worldview is concerned, but that actually work and bring in an enormous injection of scientific thinking, right? And literally a vision of the world, of the universe, that is extremely plastic, material, mechanic. If you read Dante, for example, you have there a beautiful treatise of what a medieval learned man could know. Dante studied in Paris, by the way, of this world, of looking through the world like a spectrum, and trying to understand it, understanding this multi-layered reality, this multidimensional reality, this very complicated reality, which Neoplatonism actually had denied, partly because it had also brought interesting ideas on the table, but they were a bit more dichotomic, right? Aristotle brought something more mechanical, more, applicational. I don't even know how to say it specifically. But this was born in Paris, but which, by the way, as we were saying, was also exposed. This is very important for the Kingdom of France, especially during the 13th century, to this broader which is it's also different. I can't say Occitanian, but it would take away the properly Iberian part of it. Let's say that the former lands of the Visigothic kingdom. So we're talking about this enormous area that goes from south of the Loire River in basically north of France up to the Gibraltar Strait, were historically a bit of a world on its own. That's also why I was talking about Spain a bit of a thing on it, because for reasons now we can't speak to much length. The Spain had become a crossroad of an enormous set of cultures, right? You find everything there. You find the Celts, you find the Germans, you find the Latins, you find the properly the Iberian substratum, you find the Arabs, which are not just Arabs because they bring a bit of everything. They bring a bit of properly, well, Arabia, but also all this enormous knowledge of the Hellenistic tradition, of Syria, of Egypt, of North Africa, even as far as Persia. We see it in military technology. We see it in a lot of things. Spain may be one of the single most overlooked, let's say, areas, even as far as technological development is concerned. In fact, we often say, well, it was France and Italy. In Spain, sometimes, in pretty archaic times like the 11th century, we find certain advancements that would arrive only centuries later in those other lands. Toledo, both under the Muslims and the Christians, was the single most trafficked center of learning in Europe, right? It was the place where everybody came from everywhere to learn and translate the manuscripts from Arabic, from Greek, from Hebrew, and that made also, not surprisingly, the most exposed lands to Spain in Europe, that is France and Italy, osmotically benefited from all this learning, right? That's an enormous channel. It's a very important channel. It's also banally, the one from which paper will arrive to Europe. It doesn't arrive from the east, or better, it does arrive from the east, but it passes throughout all arrives to the Atlantic in Spain, so it arrives from the west, technically. So this world had been partly incorporated with the Capetian conquest of Aquitaine and Occitania, broadly meant, also with Provence and so on. Well, technically Provence was part of the Holy Roman Empire, but let's say this broader area culturally meant that had been, I don't know, we made those videos on Gerbert of Aurillac, all these great men of thought during Middle Ages that were very unprejudiced sometimes, were very ahead of their time, so much they were even condemned, were dark legions depicted on it, and that belonged to this central and southern French that is almost Visigothic a world. Right, if you visit southern France, it's one of the single most beautiful regions in Europe, and you can breathe that air, the magic that you don't quite perceive. You can feel Spain is near. There is a Mediterranean dimension. There is even in the art, in the Romanesque architecture, there is something living underneath. That is the echo, the memory of this great past, of this great civilization, of Romano-Hellenic origin, of this Roman world that went to sleep at some point but never woke up, but still lays there. There were some of the most radically Romanized regions in Europe, and had maintained, even during the early Middle Ages, this first place in the culture of the continent, right? Because of their position of crossroad, right? Some of the most important crossroads were there. The Rhone Valley connected the Mediterranean to northern Europe. Of course, lands such as France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. It's at the center of it, right? You can imagine what this can produce on the long run, given also the importance of the respective regions. whatever. So what I would like to stress as far as the Masters of Paris is concerned is the solidarity of the students, as we already said, that was necessary to defend from the, let's say, intrusiveness of the chancellor. There was the member of the Chapitre of Notre-Dame, which was proposed by the bishop to the schools, and to whom was, granted to confer the authorization to teach. So there was kind of a solidarity developing in Paris to maintain in part even this great ideological school free. Right, it was believed that yes, it was serving a higher purpose. It was centered in a, as we have seen here, even in a reality where the church still controlled it and so on. But that, all these scholars, that were many, because Paris became soon a very also crowded center. The place where you could literally fall in love with knowledge. Right, and therefore there couldn't be a limit. Also because consider that in this reality everybody knew, and this was especially in the true in with the highest people of learning in Europe, of the existence of a past knowledge that had been somewhat lost, and together with it the transgression that it entailed, because it was realized also that it had belonged to a pagan past, that it was yet to be framed under, there was a sense of an anachronism that is exemplified also by the scholastic construction. Was a great renewal of the official Christian culture, and that began here. That was felt as properly a need, an intellectual need of daring, of knowing more. That is probably one of the single most important yet dangerous, it is true, enterprises, because definitely from these schools also emerged a lot of those that didn't help to regulate society functionally. But on the long run, I want to believe really that it was the good that prevailed. It was the rationality. Aristotle, come on. It was and also in the face, by the way, of great, Christian thinkers like Bernard of Clairvaux, that was naturally a Neoplatonist, that didn't quite like, that saw the danger, the inherent, transgressiveness of these young students that wanted to know what didn't pertain just to the spirit, but also to the matter, for example. Well, that to me, and that is, I'm very open about it, that's a side of Christian culture that, in fact, I do not pretend to be right, to have ever been right, even just biblically speaking. That is to concentrate just on the spiritual side. I mean, the Bible naturally says that, but it says it to make us understand how important and how potential it is, how much can be achieved if you really concentrate on the value of what you have as with a consciousness, with a spirit. But it's by doing more that you bear the cross, right? Not just by humiliating yourself or to become, naturally many people have also different ways to live spirituality. There are people, we know it simply by also psychological statistic, that there are certain people that are simply more ascetic than others, that are more sensitive, more emotional, more spiritually projected, more that's their thing, so they will do that thing. But this cannot exclude other applications. This cannot exclude what serves to heal people, what is science, and there is, in fact, with the scholastic, the most obvious declaration of this, that Christianity gives itself a definitely scientific face. That is to say, the world must be understood materially, scientifically. It's not just, it's a mission, it's a duty. Like the creation is being entrusted by God to mankind, and mankind has to decipher it as a divine mandate, because the creation is literally in the world's hands, in the man's hands. It's not just like a place that God keeps under control, but mankind just dwells there. No, that was the Garden of Eden. Man has fallen now. Now we have the burden, the responsibility of our own world, which includes to understand the world. So since the Genesis, there is one of the most radical hymns to scientific culture in the whole history of mankind, right? And I presume that there can't be any true Christian. I do not recognize any Christian that is anti-scientific, right? There is no Christianity without science, and vice versa, by the way, because what's the logos according to you? But this is an important theological realization to me that I like to point out, because this is exactly what these people were struggling to define, right? And that's why these clashes, even among the masters of Paris, the bitter hostilities, competition, so on, criticism. If you read the letters, sometimes there is a ferocious, violent, threatening language. It's incredible. Well, this is born also by a community of students and their masters. So by people that are there essentially just to learn, right? As we have seen in the Italian universities, it was a lay culture. These people, they did essentially for money, for practical reasons, right? For making society also work better and thinking about the political theory behind it. While the masters of Paris were struggling for dedicating a life to the intellect, which is a different thing. It is very, 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 very important to stress also. And naturally, in Christian culture, both these elements compenetrated each other. Right, you can't say that France was in a way there weren't these separations. Okay, everybody went to France and to Italy to study, so that's not properly the point. And you could say definitely that the theological studies were more oriented, were more fitting for the clergy. Eventually, yes, it is true, surely. There is a more ecclesiastical character of Master of Paris and a more lay character of the jurists of Bologna. That's pretty clear. There are similar dynamics in England, for example. In Oxford, the Chancellor of the Bishop of Lincoln became quite soon emancipated from the prelate and was elected by the university itself. So even in England, we see how the university emancipates itself in a context that was originally dominated by the bishop, controlled by the bishop. There is an emancipation. And these are some of the highest centers of learning as well in Europe, as Oxford, and even in here there will be in fact problems of heterodoxy. It's a pity we don't properly make a history of medieval philosophy, but it would be necessary also to understand certain aspects of this sort, to see also what these centers have produced concretely. To end once again with Bologna, the ecclesiastical protection was present here too, right? And in 1219, there is the formation of a namely dependency of the university by the local archdeacon. This happened for papal interference, but even in here, even if it's formally recognized, the archdeacon's powers are very limited, and the reason also why Bologna acquired it was that was trying to emancipate itself from what was the local power, the commune, right? So even in here, don't think it was much of an ideological problem, but rather the fact that whichever power locally tried to control the university, because it was a lot of money coming in, all these students from all over Europe. So there were enormous interests behind it. It's a problem because also these universities were ferocious. Don't think that it was such a positive thing at some levels. I mean, we know that there were brawls, fights, violence, but what could you do, right? The students could threat to change city and not to see them anymore. So and the local residents could say, well, these are just bands of thugs, because let's be a Goliardy has always been about extreme violence, transgression, profound violence. I mean, we know it. We know that the peak of male creativity is associated to the one of male crime, and it's in a way the history of civilization. So there were bitter struggles, but I mean very bitter ones, that would bring to secessions. Certain other Italian universities, for example, were born out of this. And the only reason here why the Bolognese naturally accepted the ecclesiastical and here especially papal interference was the papal interest towards Bologna that was that lured basically the university to say, okay, if you formally accept my protection, we can basically lower the pressure that the city poses on you. Because by the way, the papacy was trying. These were the Roman, the Emilian areas technically, but they were part of also broader areas close to them that the Pope was fighting for over against the emperor. In fact, in 1278, Bologna will pass into the papal domains, namely because still it was a thing on its own. But the university, in this sense, became a political pawn, right, to determine who was within the city that could, be from one side or the other, and so on. So for today, I think we stop here. I didn't know what to do today. Instead, I think we talked about interesting things, and we will keep talking about medieval universities at other times. So for now, just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.